Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first knowledge sharing event for the Rural Violent Crime Reduction Initiative, focusing on problem solving and the SARA model. My name is John Conley, Senior Program Officer with the LISC Safety and Justice Team, one of the two training and technical assistance providers for the program, alongside our friends at the National Policing Institute, hereafter referred to as the Institute. The Rural Violent Crime Reduction Initiative is funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance at the United States Department of Justice. So we have with us today John Markovich, Senior Policy Advisor from BJA, and I anticipate you'll be hearing from him throughout the course of the presentation. In terms of today's agenda, I'm just going to walk through a couple quick introductory slides to provide kind of a recap or reminder on the goals and overview of the Rural Violent Crime Reduction Initiative, expectations of grantees, and a few quick notes around the training and technical assistance support available through LISC and the National Policing Institute, or the Institute. I'll then turn it over to our guest speaker and presenter, Julie Wartel, and we look forward to what will hopefully be a robust conversation. Encourage folks over the course of Julie's presentation to put in comments or questions in the chat. There'll be opportunities for her presentation for kind of group discussion as well. And we're also going to try to hold the last, hopefully 5 to 10 minutes for question and answer as well. Also want to recognize a few additional LISC Safety and Justice colleagues that are on the line today. Matt Perkins, Program Director for Safety and Justice, who has been a fantastic partner for me in supporting the TTA development for this program, as well as our boss, Mona Mangat, Vice President for the LISC Safety and Justice team. With that said, let's jump right into it. So a quick overview again of the Rural Violent Crime Reduction Initiative program. It's designed to support the development and implementation of problem-solving strategies that specifically address violent crime occurring in rural areas and affecting rural populations. It's really meant to be committed to community collaboration, criminal justice partner cooperation, victim-centered approaches, evidence-based strategies, and hopefully being able to measure crime reduction outcomes. There's been a total of 21 sites awarded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and the funding to those sites is intended to improve training, development of technology, to reduce violence and its impact on rural communities, improve communication and collaboration between local law enforcement and the communities they serve. This next bullet point, I think, is really important, addressing the unique criminal justice challenges that are found in rural areas, as well as expand community-based crime prevention programs and partnerships with victim service providers. And we're in the process of launching both through LISC and MPI, or excuse me, the Institute, additional micro-grant opportunities that will be awarded to enhance communities of practice. In terms of grantees and expectations, hoping that sites will be able to document the development and implementation of strategies to reduce the violent crime problem they're seeking to address, and committing to measuring violent crime outcomes both before and after the implementation of the strategies that were selected and appropriate for the scope and nature of the problems identified. So just a quick note on training and technical assistance. LISC and the Institute will hopefully be able to support grantees throughout the program, focusing on community engagement strategies, use of technology, problem-solving implementation, which of course will be a key focus of today's knowledge sharing event, and strengthening collaborative partnerships. And just a reminder of those 21 sites that were funded by BJA, LISC has the first 6 sites assigned to us that you see on the list, with 7 through 21 assigned to the Institute, but we're always looking for ways to collaborate in providing training and technical assistance support, with this knowledge sharing event being one example. So that's just a very quick overview of the Rural Violent Crime Reduction Initiative program. It's now my pleasure to introduce Julie Wartel, founder of the Problem Analysis Group. Julie really began her career providing crime analysis support and coordination to the San Diego Police Department and then the San Diego District Attorney's Office. Since then, she's provided support to problem solving and community safety projects across the country, has authored countless publications on the topics of crime analysis and problem solving, and has been a longtime subject matter expert partner for both LISC, the Institute, and BJA. So in short, we're really lucky and pleased to have her here today. And I'm happy now to turn the presentation over to Julie.
Mute, there you go. Thanks very much, John. And nice to see those of you I know. Nice to meet and hopefully talk to, and the start of a relationship with those that I don't know. So John did a great summary of 30 years in the business, starting at San Diego PD, which was really, I was ingrained in problem solving in the SARA model. And in addition to working with police departments and communities throughout the country, I also teach at UC San Diego and a researcher there on the homelessness hub. So with that, lots of things to talk about and say, and I'm going to go through this, but please ask questions, and hopefully we'll have some good time for discussion. Okay, let's see if I can click this through. Oh, look, now I'm going too fast. Okay, so why is problem solving important? I mean, problem solving in general is always a good skill to have, but in terms of crime reduction, to reduce crime, we really need to know what causes it. What we've often done is treat the symptoms, and similar to a medical analogy of if you go into the hospital with a broken arm and they treat it, you go home and you fall down again and break your leg and they treat it, nothing's going to change until they get to that underlying cause of you keep falling down. What's the underlying reason you're falling down? So if we think about that in terms of crime, we can treat places by arresting people or using enforcement or just using extra patrol, but we're never going to get at that underlying problem unless we really dive into what is causing that specific problem at that specific place at that specific time. And that's really what I'm going to talk about today with the SARA model and how it helps you get to that point. So why take a problem-solving approach in terms of crime reduction? Well, offenders are rarely caught. Normally, if I was standing in front of a group, I would ask everyone, you know, what percentage of offenders are caught in your jurisdiction? So it's a little harder on a webinar or on a knowledge sharing online event. So I'll just say that especially property crime, very, very low. And a lot of the work that we were doing, auto theft is a great example that between 8 and 10% of auto thieves are caught. So if we focus just on catching bad guys, and my work with the district attorney's office, we took it to the next level of saying from the original auto theft all the way through our offenders getting any sort of punishment, it turned out it was less than 5% of all auto thieves or auto thefts were solved by using the criminal justice system. So that's one check of why we need to go beyond just the criminal justice system. High intensity enforcement is not sustainable. No one that I know, no agency has enough resources to always just do high intensity enforcement. So we need to think about other ways. The criminal justice system is overburdened. Those of us in California, we know we're letting out more people than are even going into the criminal justice system or into prison. And so we can't rely on that, and we shouldn't be relying on that. Most of what police are expected to address isn't crime. So if we look at calls for service, and I'm a big advocate of when you are looking at your crime problems, that really looking at calls for service is a better indicator of what's going on in the community. So no matter whether you look at the biggest, most violent cities or small rural jurisdictions like yourselves, that the top calls for service, the top things that your officers or deputies are spending time on are really disturbances, domestic violence, often verbal. So none of those part one crimes or the serious crimes. I shouldn't say none, but not usually in the top. And then lastly, residents care most about non-crime issues. For any of you that have been out to a community meeting and say, what do you care about in your neighborhood? You hear about traffic, you hear about people loitering. Again, so not that we have to put aside violent crime because we still need to focus on that, but we also need to consider a lot of these other quality of life or antisocial behavior or those types of disturbances that people don't feel safe in their own community. And that's where problem solving can really be effective. So what types of crime and disorder problems do small, rural, and tribal places face? And this is where I'm going to put it out to you guys. Either shout it out, type it into the chat. I want to hear from you on the most serious problems, and not serious being violent crime necessarily, but serious in terms of what are you spending your time on? Let's see how talkative these people are. Domestic violence, right? Good, Chris, thanks. Others? It's a quiet bunch, so I'll bring it up. There we go. Intimate property crimes. Thank you, Steve. So in looking at what the sites that are here today, a lot of what you're focusing on combined with some of my experience in working noise, as Joseph said. So you have a lot of these, again, quality of life or disturbance types of things. So in terms of violent crime, assaults, and those assaults might be intimate partner violence, but there's also lots of assaults going on around bars or other types of just disagreements, retaliation, etc. Intimate partner violence, I haven't listed under violent crime, but there are numerous studies that have looked at intimate partner violence, and actually some of them show that over half of the calls for intimate partner violence never turn into a crime. It's a shouting match. It's someone worried that they're about to be assaulted. And so Chula Vista, California did an excellent project, and I highlight some of these resources at the end, but really focusing on the initial call for intimate partner violence instead of waiting until a crime or an arrest has happened before creating strategies and using a problem-solving approach. Property crime, we all have property crime, no matter what size city or jurisdiction that we're in. A unique, obviously, to rural jurisdictions is farm equipment theft. A study I worked on several years ago in rural North Carolina looked at when they're reporting vehicle theft, which is farm equipment in many cases, is that they're putting the address of the house, the mailing address. But what was really occurring, and this was nice to have a bunch of students to actually go out to the property and figure out where exactly on the property were these thefts from. And it was very different. So that's how specific we need to get around our problem solving, because if the crime's happening in far parts of farms, then no amount of driving in front of the house or in front of the farm, the residential area, is going to change that. That's where we need to think outside the box. Other types of problems, substance abuse, mental health, drunk driving. Again, a lot of these happen in big cities as well, but these were some of the ones that have been highlighted as part of the small, rural, and tribal. Juvenile, traffic collisions, etc. Okay, the SARA model. So some people thought the people that created it, girlfriend Sarah, wife Sarah, that's not the case. It actually stands for something, which is scanning is the S. And scanning is really about identifying the problems. When we talk about these problems or concerns, and the concerns might be fear, that is a problem in itself, but that they're recurring. It's not just an incident. It's something that's happened 2 or more times that are similar in nature by the offender, by the victim, by the place, by the time, by the MO or method of operation, that you identify these harms or consequences of the problem. And that's really key. It's a problem that you might say, well, because it's illegal, this is happening. But what are the harms that those problems are causing? And that's really important to differentiate. At this point in scanning, you prioritize your problems, you determine goals, you confirm the existence of the problem through data collection, and that's where it starts bleeding into analysis. And then you select a problem to more closely examine. And to use the auto theft example again, in San Diego, we brought all the different stakeholders together to look at auto theft. And, some people were like, it's insurance fraud. And the others were like, it's joyriding. Oh, they're chopping cars. They're bringing them south over the border to Mexico. Those are all very different problems when we start talking about strategies to reduce them. Next up is analysis. This is where we identify and understand the events and conditions. So not just the crime itself, but what's going on leading up to it, after it, and around it. We determine what's the appropriate data that we need to collect to truly understand the problem. We do some research, and when we say research, it's not in-depth academic research. We often use research partners to do that, but we can all do our research by calling our neighboring agencies, by going on Google, etc. We're identifying the resources, and those are both assets as well as some problem resources. Narrow the scope, and then develop our hypothesis, which is really important to say, why do we think this specific problem is happening here? And you'll keep hearing me say specific. So when people say, oh, we have a burglary problem or a drug problem, we're never going to win that war. We're always need to say, well, where exactly, when exactly? Because even within burglaries, a residential burglary is very different than a commercial burglary. And even with residential burglaries, a multifamily apartment building that's having burglaries is different than dorm rooms, is different than single family homes in a gated community. So after we do the analysis, that's what we use to develop our response. One of the biggest challenges that we face is that law enforcement and communities hear about a program or a strategy that someone else has done, and they quickly adopt that without doing their own scanning and analysis. So very important to base your response, create your strategies based on the analysis that you learned in your local community, and then you want to implement these. And we're going to talk about all of these in a little more detail, but also often forgotten or just dismissed is the assessment part. Did you do what you planned to do? That's the process evaluation. Did it work? That's the impact evaluation. And so that's where you want to say, what did it look like before and what did it look like after? Again, being very careful to not say, well, total burglaries in my city were this, and then we did this and it went down, but really specific again about, I was focusing on residential burglary in multifamily units and what did it look like before and after. The important part of this, it's not a linear model. We often need to go back and say, did we identify the problem correctly, or do we need to do some rescanning? And then going back and forth also. Ideally, it would be linear, but oftentimes we need to go collect some more data, or we need to try a different response. And so we want to think about that in a much more complex manner of the SARA model. So how are problems identified? So lots of different ways, reviewing trends in police records, and not just, again, looking at the official part one, the most serious crime cases, but looking at your dispatch data, your calls for service data, looking at traffic databases, collision databases. And we'll talk a little bit more about where to get all of these resources. Mapping the incidents, just making a map. And anyone that's heard me talk about crime mapping, I talk about blob maps. We're going to see an example of what you shouldn't be doing. But we definitely can use spatial analysis to just say, wow, something's going on over in this area. Talking to people knowledgeable about the problem. And that includes the community, government. And when I say general, that's other forms of government, not just the police. Obviously, the police, other criminal justice, everyone has a perspective on specific problems. And it depends on where they live, where they work, what role they play. as to what they think the problems are that are going on. This is a great example. Andy Mills, who was the police chief in Santa Cruz when he first got there, he could look at crime data. That's what a typical police department does. It says, yes, chief, here's how many murders, rapes, robberies, burglaries, thefts, and auto thefts we had. And what he said was, well, what does the community think? So he organized a bunch of neighborhood town hall meetings to really say, what is going on in your community? Put up blank maps and have people draw on it what they think and where. There are online ways of doing that. And I'm going to talk about all of these, but a really forward way of thinking. And as you can see, in terms of what he posted, it's problem solving. It's not just crime, focusing on crime, or where are we going to do more enforcement. And then monitoring mass media as to what the problems that are going on. So we talked about the Cheers model. I had to get a beer in there somewhere. Anyone that knows me knows, but I did not come up with the Cheers model. But it's a great way of thinking through your scanning or your problem as the community. And in this regard, when we talk about the community, what individuals, groups, or organizations are affected by the problem. So it's not community in the literal form. Harmful, as I mentioned, it's what are the harms that are happening? So that's sometimes harder, sometimes easier. A great example that I like to give, I did some work at University of Cincinnati with the police, and their #1 call for service was underage drinking. So the cops are like, okay, we're going to attack underage drinking. But then if you ask, what are the harms that underage drinking is causing? It was all over the place. Well, they're more likely to be victims. They're more likely to be offenders and assault people. They're more likely to pass out and need to call the police. So transporting drunken 18-year-olds is a very different problem than having assaults in a fraternity house. Yet they're related by the underage drinking. What's the expectation? The public's expectation that the police are going to do something about that. And that is opens up a whole nother can of worms, obviously, because, a lot of times the public expects the police to do everything about everything, all social problems that just are not realistic. What are the events that are leading up to it? So if we talk about intimate partner violence, what are those events? Is it that the people are often drunk and get in a fight? Is it that the person has been abused, multi-generational? Those are certain things that we need to think about when we talk about working on the problem of intimate partner violence. Noise? Is it a party house or party houses that are causing the noise? Or is it really loud cars that are driving in front of your house? Those are two totally different problems as well. Recurring, does it recur every day, every weekend, every month, seasonally? That's what's just understanding and collecting data about that. And then that similarity. What is it about those 3, 5, 50, 500 things that are happening that are similar? Or how are they similar in nature? Oh, sorry. I think John accidentally forwarded it and I was ready anyway. So asking the right questions. So if we think about, we call this the crime triangle or the problem analysis triangle, that to have a crime that occurs, we need an offender, a target or a victim, and a place. Well, traditionally, we've always focused on, when I say we, law enforcement has focused on, let's take out the offender out of the crime triangle and we'll solve the crime problem. What we found from years of research and practice is that's not always the case, that sometimes it's much more effective to change the place. What is it about that place that's making it really easy to commit crime or low risk or high opportunity? What is it about the target or victim? And this isn't blame the victim at all. It's what are the behaviors? For victims that constantly leave their keys in their car when they run in the store and then the car gets stolen, that is about changing the behavior of the victim. The target, making sure your cars are locked, all of those types of things. The outside of the triangle, these are what we call the controllers. We want to think about who are the managers of places, the guardians of these targets or victims, and then the handlers of offenders. Knowing who they are and understanding that brings in more stakeholders. To get at that, we want to ask lots of questions. This is the analysis part. What are the incident characteristics in terms of time? You know, who are the victims and offenders? And this isn't specific names. This is groups. Are victims elderly people, or are they juveniles? Are they juveniles that walk home from school versus getting on the bus? Who are the offenders? Are they, if we're talking about juvenile crime, are the offenders fellow students at the same school? Are they outsiders? All of those are the questions. And people often say, well, you know, it's everyone. Well, if we look at everyone, yes, if we look at 100 crimes, we might have one of every age. But what we want to look at is where are the concentrations? Most of the, 50% of the offenders were between 16 and 18, or 30% of the victims were walking home from the bus when they got victimized. So what are the locations and the times of the incidents? And then who is responsible? And those are those questions about the controllers. So why should we collect data? This is often the hard part and where people stumble, but it's critical. Very, very few really good long-term crime reduction projects have not been informed by not only data, but additional data. And I'm going to talk about that too. But it really informs with what we know. It helps with consensus. It gets everyone on the same page about, is this really a problem? It debunks misperceptions. Sometimes we see that people think this park is really dangerous because they heard a story, etc. But really, in fact, it was one isolated event and the park is not dangerous at all. And vice versa. People might think a place is safe, and we need to educate people that you shouldn't be walking around at 2 in the morning on these streets or by these bars. It leads to better evaluation. In terms of, if we don't have the data to inform our decisions at the outset, then we have no way to say, did it work after we've created these strategies? So types of data. This is kind of our typical data. As I mentioned, computer-aided dispatch data, calls for service, but thinking about reactive versus proactive. Some police departments or jurisdictions do this well in terms of having a checkbox. Was this reactive by a community member called 911 or called the non-emergency line or flagged down an officer? Those would be that police are reacting. Versus proactive, officers are out there because they're told to go spend more time in that neighborhood or spend more time stopping people. We need to separate that because officers choose places and people to contact for specific purposes, and we don't want that to skew our data. Drunk driving, great example. In some states, such as California, it's legal to have a DUI, we call drunk driving checkpoint. And so officers set up at certain points and arrest people for DUI. That's proactive from the officers. If we measure our drunk driving problem just based on where the officers chose, that's going to indicate that certain places, they might move across the street and they're in a different neighborhood, and then that neighborhood would get it. So that's the importance. We want to look at both proactive and reactive, but especially if we're concerned with what is the community calling about, then we want to mainly look at reactive calls for service. Our records management system, the crimes or incidents, arrests, traffic collisions. Some departments use field interviews where they're contacting a person because they're suspicious. All good data to help us understand our problems. And then other types of policing related data. Some places have created gun or shooting databases, gang databases, pawn sales to help look at repeat burglars or repeat thieves, sex offenders. Depends on your problem as to what you're trying to understand as to what data you might want to be using. It's not always going to be all data for every problem. Other criminal justice data sources, jail. I was working on a problem with San Diego PD about 10 years ago, and it was around Somali gang crime. But we didn't have a way in our records management system to look at Somali. And so what we did was we had all arrests, and then from the jail system, they had country of birth, and we could figure out who was Somali based on that. And again, that wasn't just focusing just because you're Somali, we're going to target you, but it was trying to identify that subgroup that both were victims, teenage girls were being victimized, as well as the offenders. Prosecutor data, I knew nothing about prosecutor data until I went to the prosecutor's office. I had a good little chat with the Bonnie Dumanis, who was running for district attorney at the time. This was in 2002. She said, "What would a crime analyst do in a district attorney's office?" An inside voice said, "I have no idea." But outside voice, my problem-solving voice said, "You could bring together data from all of these different sources and places and look across jurisdictional boundaries and look at problems and problem solving." And she said, "I want to hire you." And so that was my introduction to prosecutor data. Now I'm a big fan. They have different purposes. Most people in prosecutors don't really care or understand data to look at crime problem solving, but some are, and more are over the last 5 to 10 years. Parole and probation data, depending on your jurisdiction. And a lot of police use parole and probation to look up an individual person. What we're talking about in problem solving, again, is to say, we want to look at all of the probationers for this particular crime in this particular neighborhood to see if we have any patterns of our offenders. And then there's a whole wealth of non-criminal justice government data from the Department of Motor Vehicles, the tax assessor, health, schools, land use, parks. Depending on your problems, you might want to use different sources there to, again, help us understand within all of these crimes, burglaries, noise complaints, is it coming from houses? Is it coming from the street? What's the land use type? Importance of community data. Obviously, others are collecting a lot of great data as well. We need to be concerned with HIPAA data or HIPAA rules and other things. We don't want to violate privacy, but we do want to help us understand these problems. And domestic violence advocates are collecting a lot of information, healthcare providers, very culturally specific groups. That's where we really, in the Somali project, I learned more from meeting with some Somali community leaders than I did by spending a year in the police department about the problems of these teenage girls being victimized and turned into prostitutes. Businesses have a lot of data, associations, et cetera, and obviously the faith community. So how do we collect data that's not in a system? So there are a variety of types of surveys, interviews, et cetera. The first one, environmental or site surveys. It's really thinking about that physical layout of the place. And that's why we need to focus on small places. We're not going to look at the whole city or the whole jurisdiction, especially in rural areas where it's giant, that we might not be able to even understand our problem unless we say, what is it about this part of town, this street, this open lot that's different than places that don't have this same problem? What are the security features, lighting features? What is it? And you go out there and you walk around and you take pictures, and that's what doing an environmental site survey is about. And LISC has some wonderful resources around that. Surveys, interviews, focus groups. That's when you really you have people, whether they're victims, whether they're offenders, whether they're just people being affected in the community, and you can sit down and talk to them or do some intensive surveys to get a lot of that information. Did some work in LA years ago in public housing, and we had we trained community residential leaders to go out and survey others to learn what they wanted to learn about the problems around drugs within the apartment complex. And then lastly, observations. This really gets at that behavior. What is going on that might not be captured in official data? how many people are coming and going from that particular place? If you have a park that's a problem, is it families playing in the park, or is it older people loitering and selling drugs? Those are observations that probably are not going to be in any type of data. So thinking about what should this location look like and feel like at that time of day, and those are the observations, and they should be collected systematically, again, because this data is informing you for problem solving, but it's also when other people say that's not happening, you now have the data that you've collected. So just going to briefly touch on some different types of analysis. So incident analysis, looking really at, I mean, a lot of this is what time is it happening, how is it happening, etc. Spatial analysis, the mapping, offender analysis, and then victim analysis. So we have our three sides of the triangle, and then we have the incident itself. Looking at a temporal analysis, that again, we have, if we know what time it occurred, and there are tools to look at, because a lot of times property crime, it's like, well, I left my house at 8 a.m., I got home at 5 p.m., and my house was burglarized. So you don't have a specific time, but there are tools that can help look at those ranges in time. But separating it out by weekday versus weekend, by groups of time. So you don't want to look at times just by day and night, because as we know, summer and winter, days or light and dark are different. So make sure you go down, you don't need to go down to the minute level, but looking at it in hours and then seeing patterns. This was juvenile violent crime, and the two different colors are school days versus not school days. So you can see a very different pattern. This is based on their hypothesis that something is going on. When they're in school, a lot of the crime was happening 2 to 4 p.m., but on non-school days, it was much more spread out and into the evening and late night. So this is a map in England, like in the US. A lot of police departments do these hotspot or blob maps. And what we see here, and this was given to me by Spencer Cheney, a researcher and practitioner in England, that in Clerkenwell, they had thefts of vehicles. And here was our typical blob map, that what often happens is here, police officer go out and spend time driving around the red spots. And if you ask people like, well, what do those mean? Because I've done this a lot. They go, well, that's where a lot of crime's happening. So not effective. What is effective is then diving into it. And what we could see, one of those hotspots, when they look very specifically, you can see 3 really specific hotspots within a much smaller area. Then doing some basic analysis about what types of cars are stolen. We see here, and again, does anyone see any patterns here? I'll put it out there, give myself a break on talking. Anyone see anything that jumps out about the type of car stolen? Or type of vehicle, I should say. You all still with me? Okay, I'll give in. Moving along. Scooters, yes. Thank you, Michael. It is 2-wheeled vehicles. So scooters and motorcycles in Clerkenwell are accounting for 73% of all vehicle thefts. So that's crazy. But if they can focus on that specific, then it's going to affect a large part of that reduction. Well, when they look at it, that circle that I just highlighted there, that specific place is 2-wheeled vehicle parking. So just by making that one parking area more secure will have a large effect. That's really pretty basic problem solving, doesn't cost anything, but it's going to have more of an effect than hoping that they drive around and see someone stealing a motorcycle and arrest them. So I mentioned this briefly, the 80-20 rule. It's that high concentration. It's not just about crime. It's that a small number of something is accounting for a large percentage of that. We see this in years and years and multiple looks at basic analysis as well as research, that a small amount of offenders are accounting for a large amount of the crime, a small amount of victims, and a small amount of places. And here's an example of, again, how easy to do that. In this case, a bunch of robberies. They list out the top 10 addresses. You can see it's just sorted by the total number of robberies. The second column is, well, what percentage of all the robberies does this account for? How is that cumulative? And then what percentage of all addresses does this account for? And how that is cumulative? And what you see here is that less than 10% of all addresses are accounting for 41% of robberies. So focusing on those 10 addresses and what is it about those 10 addresses that they can make change to will reduce the total number of robberies quite a bit. Repeat victimization, and thinking about when we say repeat victimization, it's, again, it could be a target, not necessarily the victim, but we want to think about how do we analyze that? Is it a hot dot? Is it a specific place? And is that dot, if it's a truly a victim, that if that person is being repeat victimized with intimate partner violence or other types of victim, bullying, assault, that dot might be in different places. And that's just something to be aware of if you're talking about repeat people victim. Are they being victimized in the same place? Or do you need those dots to be in multiple places to see any sort of patterns? Hot products, what's being stolen? And then why is that being stolen? Is it really easy to steal? And we see you go in stores and certain things are locked up, or you have to ask the person to go get that product. That's because those are hot products. Hot spots, I talked about. Hot targets, same type of thing. Catalytic converters, everywhere in the country are talking about catalytic converter theft. Those are targets. That's not it is a product, but cars are being targeted for that. And then hot people, both on the victim as well as the offender side. When we talk about hotspots, we saw a blob map that shows this overall area. Those are really easy to make. It's like a weather map. It's saying it's a high statistical concentration, except it's not a weather map because just because 3 crimes happen in that location doesn't mean 2, 1, like 90 degrees, 80 degrees, 70 degrees type of thing. So we want to think about when we use the term hotspot is it a dot? Is it a specific place? Is it a facility? Is it a corner? Is it an address of a building or a house? Because your strategies are going to be around that specific place and what you can change. If it's a victim, we want to, again, look at the different locations, but that's about educating victims. So if it's a street, which is a relatively new in crime research, and when I say relatively new, 15, 20 years, that people have really started mapping and analyzing according to the street. So whether it's traffic collisions or whether it's street robberies, then you might want to look at the entire street instead of a specific place. But again, not a whole blob, because you can't change a blob, you can change a street. The areas, if you're looking at, the only time I recommend looking at the area is to say, what is it about this neighborhood and what exists in the neighborhood? If one of your partners has these artificial boundaries of a neighborhood, then you want to look at it that way. We have a big homeless problem in San Diego, and I was in a meeting recently, and one of the guys from the Transit Authority was like, we're trying to work with the Downtown Partnership, but the Downtown Partnership, which is like our business association downtown, said, well, we only go to 12th Avenue. So just because your station is on 12th and on 13th, we can't do anything with that, which is crazy. That's where we need to knock down those artificial boundaries and look at our crime and disorder and quality of life problems over a larger area. This was some work I did in Boulder, and it was about complaints to university houses for partying. So the police department was repeatedly called over and over to certain houses off campus where students were living. The landlord association, their idea was, well, police, if you just arrest the people and tell us, we'll find those kids and then they won't do it again. And it's like, nope, that doesn't work. We know that doesn't work. What we do know works is holding the landlords accountable to not renting their houses to party kids. They were all like, not our problem. So we did this analysis. And again, we had data on which properties were rental properties and then broken down, as you can see, by the building type. So is it a house? They have a maximum occupancy for all of their rental properties. So we were able to say, if a house had 4 parties, we need to treat that differently because there are 4 people that live there versus an apartment building that has 20 properties and 40 kids in there. So we want to think about normalizing the rate. So what does that look like? We see our J curve there. With apartments, there were 7,500 calls for service to 215 apartment complexes. But what you can see is that the top 20% of the apartment buildings or complexes accounted for 58% of the calls for service. If we could change those top 20%, we're going to reduce or make a bigger impact. Same idea looking at single family housing, that the top 20% accounted for 56 or 55% in terms of that. What they used that data for was to pass an ordinance about repeat calls for service to these party houses. So very specifically holding the landlords accountable to who that they're renting to. It's been a police problem, but it shouldn't be a police problem. And that took problem solving. So here's some street segment analysis. This was done on a BCJI project up in Seattle. If you talk to people, they'd say, oh, Rainier Beach in Seattle, that's a bad neighborhood. There's a lot of crime in that neighborhood. But what you can see here is it's very few streets have a big percentage. In this case, it was juvenile crime or up through age 25. But what you see are only a small number of streets. So, if there was a blob, maybe this whole area would show up. But then these streets get a bad rap because they don't have any crime on it. They took a next step of diving into the hot streets to say, well, what types of crimes are happening on these particular streets? So here you have 2 segments right next to each other. One of them has mostly disorder. The other one has mostly property crime. And you can also see right next to it, very little crime on these neighboring streets. The importance of doing that extra level of analysis to understand what's going on there. High definition maps. This is really just, if you don't necessarily have to have fancy GIS or fancy mapping, that if you're looking at drugs in the school and you draw it onto a map or draw it onto a picture, you can see that most of these were in the locker area. So your problem solving should focus on that, because if most of them were out at the baseball field, different problem, different reactions, different strategies. Rates and denominators, I mentioned that with the calls for service, is thinking about like, what's the potential, not just total numbers. So we have here, this was auto theft, swap meet, a big flea market type place, 2,500 spaces, open 2 days a week. People park there generally an hour and a half, which was based on observational data. And then the trolley station, our tram, 7 days a week, people park there 8 hours. It was much more of a commuter. So even though the swap meet had twice as many auto thefts in a year as the trolley station, it was way riskier to park at the trolley station and have your car stolen. So we want to focus on the risky places, not necessarily just high numbers. So after analysis, you've done all your analysis. You want to make sure you finish that, but then research what are those potential strategies. What have other police departments or communities done? What does the evidence say or research say that works well for this specific problem or this specific situation? And then familiarize yourself with a concept called situational crime prevention. And what that is opportunity blocking. It's, can we increase the perceived risk that the person will get caught? Can we make it harder for the person to commit the crime? Can we decrease the perceived reward? Like, they're going to steal something, but if they can't sell it anywhere, then they're not going to get that reward. Can we remove the excuses of people saying, I didn't know that that was illegal, or I didn't know that that was wrong, and reduce the provocations? So lots more about that. I'm going to, again, give you some resources. And then lastly, assessment. Did your strategy or strategies work to reduce the problem? Is it the same? Has it been displaced? A lot of research has shown that displacement doesn't actually happen. It might spread out, but that high concentration is not going to all just move next door or to another place. And then thinking about your long-term goals. So here, and obviously this is recorded and going to share the whole PowerPoint with you all, but lots of examples of small, rural, tribal, good problem-solving efforts and case studies. And then lastly, some resources. The Center for Problem-Oriented Policing is, the Bible of problem solving in the SARA model. Lots of what I've talked about comes from here, but a ton more information. This is Crime Analysis for Problem Solvers in 60 Small Steps, a very easy to read, easy to use guidebook. There are about 80 different, very specific problem-solving guidebooks. So it's not just drugs, but drug dealing in privately owned apartment complexes. And here's how to understand your problem. Here's what's worked in other jurisdictions. And then lastly, some tool guidebooks about, looking at displacement and diffusion. And some last few resources for you. Okay, I gave us 5 minutes to talk. Sorry. Went through that fast. Questions, comments?
Thank you so much, Julie. And I stopped sharing my screen so that folks can take a look at one another, and we can have a community for quick Q&A. I welcome folks. Feel free to unmute yourselves or throw in a comment or question in the chat. I'm happy to answer.
Don't be shy.
So I see a comment about the presentation available by email. So we're hoping on our LISC website fairly soon after today to get a copy of the recording of this presentation along with a copy of Julie's deck on our website. So yes, it will be available for download and viewing. Other questions?
Julie, great presentation. I really appreciated all the information. I think it's very interesting how you can look at all of that data, and just gave me a lot to think about. So thank you very much. I appreciate that.
You're very welcome. And I see a question from Chris. We have problems capturing location of occurrence data in CAD. The address is captured where a person reported the incident. Chris, where are you from? Remind me. Vail. Beautiful place. So yeah, systems can be funny in a bad way. That there are definitely ways around it. There are also ways of, again, for a specific problem, you're not going to go into your entire CAD and say, I need to fix or figure out all of the locations. But if you have a specific problem that you're working on, and you pull, and you might even do a sample of, well, here are 50 calls, and then you actually have to read the narrative and look it up and see if there are any patterns across that. Can you give me an example of like what problem that you might be wanting to map or analyze spatially? Bar incidents. So that's a great one. Lots of research around there and disturbances, right? So I've done some work, and what we came up with was 50 feet around the bar. Because of that, like, we didn't want to capture, and I don't know, Vail, been there once or twice, but not enough time to know the layout. But in the work that I've done, you didn't want to capture too many bars, because the idea really is to figure out, are there certain bars that are generating more disturbances than other bars? And so if you have 10, 20 bars in your city, are there other ways to look at by name of bar or anything Other places, in addition to just looking at like calls for service from the bars, have done, just blanked on the name, but when they've made a drunk driving arrest, they ask the person, where was the last place, last drink survey. I knew it was going to come to me. Where was the last place you drank before you got in the car to drive? And I did some analysis for Ventura County, and it was really interesting because same bars came up over and over again. And every once in a while, you know, probably most of the bars had at least one, but there were bars that had like 20 people out of the several hundred that said it was that bar. So happy to talk to you further after this about bar issues and analyzing that.
Thanks, Julie. And I should mention before we wrap up that for LISC assigned sites, we do have the opportunity for a limited number of individual site consultations by Julie after today's event. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to your TA lead. That'd be myself or Matt Perkins. And just a few housekeeping items. We will be sending out a brief survey after today's event and really welcome your feedback there so we can continue to improve our TA services, including future knowledge sharing events. We'll try to get this posted fairly quickly onto our website and share a link for that. But also want to pause and invite John Markovich from BJA if you have any final thoughts or comments before we wrap up today as well.
Right. Yeah, I'll try to make it quick and out of respect to everybody's time. But I think Julie did a great job in sort of explaining why, well, the importance of SARA and POP, but also giving sort of a underpinning as to why we chose POP to sort of organize this project. We had a lot of different problems that you're addressing. So the underlying issue was that they're problems. Mostly they're crime problems, and you can measure reduction at crime overall or particular places. But in some instances, we have problems that aren't as readily quantifiable, such as improving services to victims of violent crime. So that is a problem. The SARA model is flexible and scalable. It could be applied to problems like that. The last thing I'll say is, John offered that there are some limited TTA engagements if you want to follow up and work with Julie for the LISC associated grantees. I think I could say the same thing for the National Police Institute associated grantees. We want to help you meet you where you're at and sort of customize the assistance to you. So we can make a follow-up call with Julie, or I know at least one of the, I think pretty sure it's a Policing Institute site is, Ashland, I think is Alabama, was very interested in POP and crime analysis. And there's some efforts afoot to make more resources available to them on that. So if this piqued your interest, please don't hesitate to step forward. And one other thing I'll say is, we have to measure performance on all federal grants. And because of the scalability and sort of ubiquitousness, I said that word right, I think, of the problem-solving approach, that's kind of, we're asking the lens, that's the lens that you're looking at when we ask you to report your performance management data. So I think this was a good grounding in that. Many of you were familiar with it, but I think Julie really addressed some of the finer points. I think gave a great overview of the flexibility of the approach. So thanks, Julie.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, we'll just wrap up. And again, thank you, Julie, for a great presentation. Thank everyone for participating today. Again, we'll follow up with a brief survey and hopefully get these materials posted on our website soon. And I see, unfortunately, we're out of time. So out of respect for everyone's schedule, I will say thanks again for attending, and we stand concluded. And best wishes to enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you all for attending.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.